In this video, we'll investigate the role of JSX, a JavaScript derivative syntax that is used to express visual elements in a React component. Let's begin. So by now, you've seen how class and function components look like and how they can be created and used. The most fundamental element in a component are the visual elements that it has to render. This is where JSX comes into the picture. It is a syntax that lets you describe what a component renders. If this is the first time that you're working with React, then you might feel a bit uneasy with the idea of incorporating visual elements such as divs, text, images, and dynamic components right within JavaScript. But herein lies real power and flexibility. You see, JSX is an extension to regular JavaScript, and while it looks a lot like HTML, it is way more powerful and expressive. JSX is like a templating syntax for React applications that makes it easy for developers to incorporate visual elements and dynamic data in a format and syntax that they're somewhat familiar with from the get-go. But the real power behind JSX is that it lets you use JavaScript all the way. Let's look at a quick example before we discuss further. Begin by downloading the project archive from the link given on the screen. Then extract this project and from within the start folder on the terminal, run npm install to download and set up dependencies. Once they're installed, run npm start to kickstart the development server. I have the fruitbasket.js file open from the src folder. Here we have a class component named fruitbasket with an array of fruits stored in a state variable. I already have the development server up and running for this example. We want to render a list of these fruits using the fruit function component. To achieve this, we have to iterate over the array of fruits, producing an instance of the fruit component for every item in the list. So we'll first create a pair of curly brackets, which allows us to implement JavaScript expressions within a JSX template. Then all we have to do is use a standard JavaScript map function on the this.state.fruits array and produce instances of the fruit component, passing in the name of the fruit through the name prop like so. The result is a list of fruits on the UI. As you saw in this quick example, we were able to use the map method, which is a regular JavaScript method, to produce instances of the fruit component. React actually encourages the use of standard JavaScript instead of forcing you to use library or framework-specific methods and directives. This makes it easier for developers to embrace React because you don't have to waste your energies on learning an opinionated syntax just to be able to use the library. Your existing knowledge of JavaScript is given due importance and is used extensively. You may have noticed that JSX differs a bit from HTML, and we have already discussed this fact. JSX is not HTML. For instance, instead of using an attribute called class, we use class name. And we can create event listeners like onClick as we saw in the last video. You've also seen the use of curly braces for rendering a dynamic value or for integrating a JavaScript expression. But how exactly does JSX work? We mentioned earlier that JSX is a templating language, which means it lets us describe visual elements in an HTML-like syntax, but internally, it transforms that syntax into code that React actually uses. JSX is designed to produce React elements. So when you write JSX, it is compiled into standard JavaScript functions containing nested invocations of the createElement function, which is what React uses to create renderable elements internally. In fact, JSX is nothing more than syntactic sugar for the createElement function from the React library. The createElement function takes in 3 arguments. The first is the type of element or the reference to a component. The second argument is an object where key value pairs translate to props and their values. The final argument is for child components or content that needs to go between the opening and closing tags of an element or a component. The JSX on the left is thus compiled into the code that you see on the right. This transformation is made possible by the React scripts package, which internally uses Babel and Webpack. A great developer experience is key, and React certainly provides one, enabling all kinds of developers to easily embrace the library for their projects. JSX is one way by which React makes it easy for developers to express visual elements and layouts and still retain the expressiveness of JavaScript. You can use JSX directly within functions and JavaScript expressions, such as the one you see here. There are, however, a few things you should know before you venture into JSX. Attribute names in JSX, unlike HTML, must be in camel case, just as they would be when using DOM APIs in JavaScript. For instance, in this example, we have two attributes, class name, which is used to set a CSS class name for the element, and an on-click event listener. While class name is used in place of the class attribute in HTML, because class is a reserved keyword in JavaScript, note how it is written in camel case. Likewise, the on-click attribute allows you to register an event listener for when the user clicks on the element. The value of this attribute points to a method that will run when a click is registered. This naming convention mirrors how we access attributes using standard DOM APIs. While this restriction applies to all attributes, React 16 and above do allow you to use browser-specific and non-standard attributes or even newer API attributes. Now, every attribute must have a value. Static string values can be expressed in a pair of double quotes, like how you would in HTML. Dynamic values, on the other hand, are expressed in a pair of curly braces. The value within curly braces can be an expression and hence allows you to use standard JavaScript to access values, invoke functions, and more. This is what allowed us to use the map method in the fruit basket example to render instances of the fruit component. Curly braces allow you to pass in values as arrays, numbers, objects, and not just strings. This is critically important, especially when using props to accept data from a parent component, which could be in any format and not just a string. There are other reasons for using curly braces. For instance, if you have to use inline styles on a component, you can do so by using a pair of curly braces on the style property and passing in an object with camel-cased version of CSS properties and their values. Curly braces expressed between the opening and closing tag for a component or an element allow you to render child objects. In a nutshell, using a pair of curly braces allows you to set or pass dynamic data on your elements and component tags. Now, elements in JSX are expressed as tags in much the same way as you would in regular HTML. Custom-made components are also expressed as tags. Here, you can see an HTML div element with a text area field inside. In this case, the names of the tags div and text area are expressed in lowercase just as it would be in HTML. On the other hand, React components also need to be expressed within JSX. This allows you to compose together multiple and isolated components to build a larger UI or application. In this case, however, the names must begin with an uppercase character. This is an important naming convention that you must adhere to. It also allows you to easily distinguish between standard HTML elements and React components in a layout. Also note here that a closing tag is not needed if there's no data to process between the tags. But in such a case, a self-closing tag is mandatory, as you can see here. Now that you are well acquainted with JSX, let's create a small login form component that allows our user to type in an email ID and a password. Start by downloading and extracting the project archive from this link. Then extract it to a folder on your computer and run npm install to download all dependencies. I already have my hot reloading server up and running using npm start. This project contains the style sheet that we want to use for building our elements. We have here our login component.js file where we want to build a simple component that renders a login form. At this time, you can see I have a simple function component here that uses the createElement method instead of JSX to render a div with the class name set to login component. We also have the word hello as the child element in the div. The first thing I'll do is remove the createElement function, and instead we'll render the same div as JSX. The moment you save this file, you'll get an error on the terminal and on the page. As you can see from the error message, we need to have React in the scope when using JSX. This means I must import React in every component file that uses JSX. Next, I'll add an HTML span tag with the ID set to title and a text label. Notice how the span is in lowercase since this is standard HTML. Now we need two form fields for capturing the user's email ID and password. I'll thus build a new function component called form input, which we must name in title case as you can see here. Since function components receive a prop argument, we'll expand it using destructuring to implement two props: type, which will let us set the type of input field, and placeholder, which can be used to set the placeholder text. Inside this function component, we'll first create a div with the class name formFieldHolder, and this will include an input field. Here we can bind the type attribute to the type prop using a pair of curly braces, and we'll do the same thing with the placeholder attribute as well. This will now let us dynamically render different types of input fields by just configuring props. So let's now render an instance of the form input component like so, and we'll set the type to text and placeholder to email. Notice how I'm adding a / right before the closing tag. This is known as a self-closing tag, and such elements or components do not accept a child object. Self-closing tags are essential when working in React. Save the file and you can now see a text input box on the UI. Right below it, we'll create yet another instance of the form input component, and this time I'll set the type to password and placeholder to password like so. And we get our password input field. The beauty of components is that they promote reusability, and you can see a prime example of this feature here, where a component is used twice to render two different kinds of elements. Now we need a button. So I'll create yet another component which will allow me to run a function whenever the button is clicked using a prop called clicked. For the layout, I'll again create a div with the class name formFieldHolder, and I'll include a button inside. On the button, we'll create an onClick event listener, which is then bound to the clicked prop. When a function is passed to this component using the clicked prop, it will be invoked when the user clicks on this button. I'll now add the login button component like so, and we'll set clicked to an anonymous function that just throws an alert dialog. And we're done. Do note, however, that we have just built a raw UI, and there are more things that can be done here to turn this into a usable login component. As you saw in this example, JSX allows you to express both visual elements and JavaScript. You must have React in the scope before you can use JSX in your components, and you can use a pair of curly braces to express dynamic values such as functions, arrays, objects, and more. And internally, React simply converts JSX into create element invocations that actually do the work. I'm sure by now you understand and recognize components as a fundamental building block of a React application. They are easy to build and powerful enough to be turned into reusable units that can help you realize a comprehensive application.